This is the third installment of me reading my viewers' poetry. My name is Imogen. I am a poet and teacher of poetry workshops. And today we have two really exciting poems to read. One is called Serenity Beach by Isaac Green. The other is Fairy Dust by Kate. Both of these have been submitted through the Google form, which you can find down below if you want me to read your poetry. And without further ado, let's get into it. The first poem we're going to read is Fairy Dust by Kate. And we have an excellent question at the bottom, which I think will be really useful to keep in mind while reading this poem. And that is, how well do I bridge the gap between thought-provoking and creative, but also not too hard to understand or pretentious? And this is a really interesting, important question. I think something that gets talked about a lot as writers, as poets, is this idea of being pretentious and what that means. But before we can answer a question like that, we of course need to read this poem, understand it. So here is Fairy Dust. I don't like dust. How careless it is. Lifeless, gray, and dull, erasing the ancestors who unleashed the hope for something more. Because the dust is all that people can see. Makes me sneeze in an attempt to silence me, replacing discovery with dust. We keep choking without changing. Then there's no fear of failing. But I insist I will never become dusty. There's nothing subtle here. My arms are made to wrap around you and never let you go. My arms let me release my creativity. You cannot stop me from writing. They are tools to extract my thoughts from my brain and extend them to your ears. Let my words be the spell that keeps us wishing. I turn into a fairy when I step on stage. My wings are my voice. When I read to you, my wand is the pen I use to write. And when I fly with passion, other people rise up too. So I will use it with conviction. When the dark days just keep coming, I will be here to light the way. Not only do my feet leave footprints, but my mind leaves imprints too. My poetry forms a trail of identity and artistry like fairy dust, leaving hope for my people. As we know, the best writing is made when we all come together. So come on, let's make the world shimmer. Fairy dust. And this poem is really lovely, right? Sort of a poem about poetry. We sort of have a word for this. Ars poetica is sort of the Latin word for this. A poem about the art of poetry, and it has this lovely metaphor, right, of dust and these sort of two kinds of dust, and sort of a transformation between these things that happens basically right here, this transformation. And I think that's a lovely moment for this poem. And we can really kind of divide it into this before section and this after section in a way. So in the beginning, right, we're talking about one kind of dust. I don't like dust. And this, is our gray, dull, dusty, dead kind of dust, right? How careless, lifeless, gray, and dull. Setting this thing up as uninteresting, which I think is sort of cool, right? We begin this poem, fairy dust, right? Maybe expecting something beautiful, and then we say, I don't like dust. How dull it is, how careless, all of this. And then we continue to expand on the idea of what dust is, right? Erasing the ancestors who unleashed the hope for something more. right? And this, along with the previous line, lifeless, starts to characterize this dust really as something associated with death, right? Erasing the ancestors, you know, urns, dead people, uh, just lifeless gray dull. The ancestors who unleashed the hope for something more. And here we're starting to create this sort of contrast, right, between death and dullness and emptiness of this dust, along with sort of what it gets in the way of. And that is this hope, this something more, which we're definitely going to come to later as we talk about the fairy dust, right? Because the dust is all that people can see, makes me sneeze in an attempt to silence me. And this is interesting, right? The idea that the dust is sort of acting in this way, trying to silence me, and this is something that people are always looking at. Of course, death in an ultimate capacity will silence us in the end, right? And it's interesting that we have make me sneeze. This sort of seems to act in contrast to me to what we see later, right? Where we are speaking poetry and these sort of beautiful words, and this dust later is something intentional, something beautiful, something spoken. And the idea that this dust sort of just has this, negative sneeze kind of reaction, I think is acting as a nice contrast here. Going back because dust is all that people can see is kind of a cool description, right? All that people can see. As if we're sort of focused on death and afraid of death, or maybe that we live in a world that isn't very beautiful and is a lot of gray, dull, lifeless. I think if we think of a lot of modern society, right? Replacing discovery with dust, right? There's not so much emphasis on beauty and creation and connection, and as we say later in the poem, right, togetherness, right? Sort of acts as a contrast to, maybe society and a lack of appreciation for this beauty. So we're setting up dust not just maybe as literal dust, but also dust as a representation of death, but also dust as a representation of a world that is dulled and a world that isn't beautiful, at least as I read it on a first pass, which is, of course, a very subjective thing. We keep choking without changing. So here's another facet to dust, right, which maybe connects to lifeless and careless, choking without changing. Without changing, we are like inert, apathetic. And maybe this speaks to some of that gray, disconnected society, a sort of depressed existence without color, without vibrance. Then there's no fear of failing, right? If we're not changing, if we're not doing anything, if we're not, in this case, creating art, taking a risk, right? Then there is nothing. And I love that a fear of failing is considered to be a good thing. The opportunity to fail is positive in this poem because the opportunity to fail is an opportunity to change. And I think that's a really lovely idea generally, but also for the artist, because we create so much and perform so much, and so often creating art is a lot of failure, right? I've failed a lot as a poet. I think most artists fail a lot before they get good at something, right? So this is I think a really strong line because it creates a whole additional aspect to this dust for me that can be done very succinctly. And then we have this turn. But I insist I will never become dusty. There's nothing subtle here. My arms are made to wrap around you and never let you go. My arms let me release my creativity. So, we create an alternative to dust. And a very a powerful one, a sort of magical one. My arms are made to wrap around you and never let you go. Right? There is this sense of permanence. Right? I will never become dusty. I'm going to not die. And there's actually a number of ways to read this. I will never become dusty, right? I will never become apathetic and inert. I will never become dead. I will never become afraid of failing, or, I will never become averse to action, right? Such that I do not, um, fail. I will never become not afraid of failing. I will never become gray and dull, right? I'll never get old. There's this idea of an immortalization. And this is something we talk about in art a lot. Art has this way of becoming immortal, right? Creating something that can persist for a very long time. We think of very ancient works of art, like, I guess, very topical for when this is being recorded. The Odyssey, the movie, just came out by Christopher Nolan. And that work, the Odyssey, has persisted for thousands of years, right? So art has a way of doing this. So this can read in multiple ways, right? We'll get to art later, right? And, I'm a fairy when I step on stage, and, my wings are my voice. That art, right, has this way of making life vibrant, or making life stay young and youthful and energetic and exciting. I think there's a really lovely thing of just using the idea of fairy dust here, because to think of like fairies is a very, fairy tales, but it's a very youthful image, right? We can think of a young child believing in fairies and fae and magical creatures. And I think that works really well for this poem because it contrasts dust as age, dust as death. And through a youthful, artistic sort of position of creation, we can sort of escape the idea of death. There's nothing subtle here. I kind of like this line, a little break of the third wall, as to say, like, I will never become dusty. And that's not being subtle. That's not, some sort of metaphor or like oblique thing. It is, I will never become this. I am never going to let go. It is permanent. It isn't a subtle thing. It's this exaggerated way of living, right? Because that's the counterpart to the dust, to the lifeless, to the gray, to the dull. Maybe this is sort of subtle in a way that we don't want to be. The poet, the voice in this poem does not want to be. You cannot stop me from writing. They are tools to extract my thoughts from my brain and extend them to your ears. I love the feeling of care I think that this exhibits. Right, we have this never let you go, and you could certainly be the reader. Whenever we see you or I in a poem, it can be useful to ask this question: who is you? Right? Because oftentimes this can be a number of people, or who is us, or who is the they, or who is I. Sometimes we write poems where I isn't me. I isn't the poet. And you, I think, could be a specific person. And in that case, this is a really beautiful individual message, right? My arms are made to wrap around you and never let go, right? They are tools to extract my thoughts from my brain and extend them to your ears. This almost creates the feeling of like a person who is the muse, someone who the poet is speaking to, who everything they make is made for that person. And that's a really, common thing that comes up in art, and just an immensely powerful one. This could also be the general reader. And then this takes on another meaning, the one that is sort of more akin to the artistic immortality of, the Odyssey, the permanence, the never let you go. My arms are made to wrap around you, the reader, and never let you go. And then at that point, it says, this art will continue. It will continue to touch people, to bring them in, to share this experience, right? Continue to release the creativity. They are tools to extract my thoughts from my brain and extend them to your ears, you, the reader, the general person who will, read this poem again and again and again into time. And then it becomes this great kind of declaration, right? Toward you, the reader, as this almost vector of immortalization, right, of the writer. Let my words be the spell that keeps us wishing. And again, we can see this us as, me and you, right? Or we can see it as me and then you, the general reader, sort of everybody. And this works in both cases, where art is that thing that gives hope, right? That gives care, that gives life, that gives energy, that is, the wish, right? This wish is something directed toward the future. It's something imaginative. Or with a single individual, right, that keeps us wishing, has a similar feeling, right? It's just more immediately personal. I turn into a fairy when I step on stage. My wings are my voice when I read to you. My wand is the pen I use to write. And when I fly with passion, other people rise up too. So I will use it with conviction. So we create this sort of scene within the poem, right, of being on stage and this characterization, as I said earlier, this sort of transformation, right, which is sort of a magical thing, becoming this fairy, going from normal person, artist, poet, writer in this first half and this opening to a magical being, right? So this speaks to art as something that can literally, or, magically, metaphorically transfigure someone into something else. And so, yeah, my wings are my voice when I read to you, right? Something that I can sort of fly with and be free and, go to these places. My wand is the pen, great imagery to have the pen turn into the wand. And when I fly with passion, right, so we're connecting the sort of wings to the flying, other people rise up too, so I will use it with conviction. And I like this. People rise up too, so I will use it with conviction. And it's because I can sort of help others, inspire others, show them magic, that I will do this thing. And we see this a lot with, like, the fairy godmother, or just the fairy in general of, fairy tales or folklore, is you'll have this fairy, this magical woman, usually could be male. You have like Peter Pan, right? Comes in and somehow uses their magic to like benefit someone else, right? We have the fairy godmother in Cinderella, who creates the whole glass slippers and outfit for the ball. We have all sorts of instances of this. So this works really nicely and consistently with like the image set up of the fairy, of the fairy dust, of the magic, and yeah, speaks to art as something that transcends reality, which is really useful, right? Because you say this thing earlier, right, that art will sort of allow you to never become dusty. You make this magical claim that sort of acts in contrast to the reality that we set up in the opening stanza. And this is sort of where it all comes circle and says, it is this magic of helping others, of allowing others to rise simply through words, through art, right? That reality can be shaped. And it's a very powerful thing, very affirming, I think, to the poet or to any artist, really. When the dark days just keep coming, I will be here to light the way. Not only do my feet leave footprints, but my mind leaves imprints too. So, right, I think artists can act as this beacon of hope in difficult times. And of course, we exist in quite difficult political times. And it is art that can do so many things, right? Art can allow us the sort of lyric escape, right, of going to a better world. Art can also inspire us to like act and to change. It can be rallying, right? So it can leave footprints to follow. It can just be a light in the darkness, right? Leaves imprints. My mind leaves imprints too. Art has this way sometimes of like teaching or showing people new truths they didn't know. So you sort of very concisely characterize a lot of different ways that art can be useful in, the dark days mentioned, right? Just being a light, being a comfort, being something to follow, being something teaching and inspiring. My poetry forms a trail of identity and artistry like fairy dust, leaving hope for my people. This my people stuck out to me because it connects way back to the top in a way, where we have the dust erasing the ancestors, right? And in a sense, as we leave hope for someone, and we have the ancestors who unleashed hope for something more, this sort of is the immortalizing act of like becoming that ancestor, right? But not dying and fading into dust like others, but instead leaving behind a form of dust that is so much more vibrant and inspiring and leaves hope instead of, being erased. And I think that ties in really nicely as a single line with this feeling of art as this sort of eternal youth that we create. My poetry forms a trail of identity and artistry like fairy dust. I think identity is a useful word here, right? In these dark times, and with this connection with ancestry, right? Identity is sometimes this thing that connects people and brings them together, right? Whether that's a racial identity or a like queer identity that connects people, these are kind of things that both get attacked in dark times and also become a point of unity and togetherness in spite of that. So I think that works well. As we know, the best writing is made when we all come together. So come on. Let's make the world shimmer. And it's a nice ending, right? It has that sort of moral to it. It has that lesson in a way, which feels very consistent, I think, with the fairy tale, right? That in the end, there's this sort of turn toward teaching, and also a sort of like happy ending is what we create, right? Come on, we can come together, we can do this, we can make the world more beautiful together as artists, as people, through community. And I think that's a really lovely way to cap off a poem like this. Now you ask the question, and it's a really good question. How well do I bridge the gap between thought-provoking and creative, but also not too hard to understand or pretentious? So we have a few things, right? You contrast thought-provoking / creative, right? Thought-provoking and creative is against hard to understand and pretentious. And I think this makes sense. I should spell pretentious correctly. Pretentious. Not an easy word. Um, we contrast these two things against each other, and this makes sense. Sometimes we see works that are very sort of obscure, right? And impenetrable and difficult, and that makes them very hard to understand, but they can be seen as very creative because they're like doing something outside of the realm of, sort of normalcy. Maybe a work that comes to mind for me is maybe The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. This is a big poem. It's like four poems in one poem, and it's many, many pages, and it's super dense and symbolic and confusing and very thought provoking and creative, and it is very hard to understand. And I think maybe some people might say pretentious. I quite like it. Um, but it makes sense to have this association. Now, I think we absolutely can be thought provoking without being hard to understand, right? And that's maybe something we can strive for as artists, is to provoke the mind while also making something that is understandable. That can be a good way to approach art. Not the only way, though. But that's all sort of abstract, and you're asking about your poem, right? Um, so how do we bridge this gap? How well do I bridge this gap? And I think in terms of thought provoking, right? This poem works quite well, right? You have a lot of these connections that go beyond the poem, and some cool kind of subtle things are going on, like this connection between, my people, hope, ancestry from the top of the poem to the bottom, this idea of art as something that transforms and that can sort of surpass a difficult reality. I think that's very inspiring and very hopeful. And to inspire hope is to inspire a thought, right? To inspire, some amount of maybe like validation of the artist, right, is a thought. Creative, yeah, right. You're using this cool metaphor of the fairy in a way that's works well on the surface, but is also very satisfying in some deeper ways, right? The idea that the ending kind of rings in this way that's like a fairy tale. The idea, right, of this literal transformation, magical transformation in the middle of the poem, I think works really well in this, fairy tale setup. I mean, we can even think going back to like Cinderella, right? The Cinderella story, she begins like kind of destitute and like doesn't have anything, and she's with like the evil stepmother or whatever. And then, jeez, is my phone being loud? Uh, or the godmother, right? Or the stepmother's the evil one, and then the godmother comes along, transforms her, right? And then we get this, kind of fairy tale ending, right? And so it follows that structure really well, and I think that's a very creative thing to do. Uh, Now, hard to understand or pretentious, right? I'm not a great person to ask hard to understand. I read like hundreds of poems, and you know maybe if you look at me like analyzing this poem and none of this is what you intended, then maybe that means it was hard to understand for me. I need to silence my phone. Oh my gosh. Um, I guess I should edit this out. I probably won't, because I can't really be bothered to do that. I'm a poet. Uh, so so hard to understand, right? I don't think so. And I think this poem does a lot of things to help itself be understandable. When we place this poem about, art and poetry and self and identity and ancestry and these themes inside this like package that people understand, the fairy tale, right? The dust, the transformation, the beauty, right? When we place it in, I think, fairly like straightforward, simple terms, I think I think you do a lot for yourself for understanding, right? And and that's good. Like I think on a surface read without any analysis, It's like, oh, we start at dust, we become magical, we're going to make the world shimmer. That's a great, like, 3 act story. And then there's a lot more to read into, which I think is the idea of bridging the gap, right? Understandable on the surface, not hard to understand. But then when you think more about it, right, and dig into it, it provokes these kind of interesting things. Now we have the question of like pretentiosity, which is a word people love to throw around. And I think one tricky thing is a lot of people use this in different ways. So, one way I've heard pretentious is a work that looks down on its reader, right? Art that's sort of like condescending and like expects something of you, uh, or like that thinks it is superior in some way, egoistic, right? That's one way that I've heard of pretentious art. Or it's like trying to tell the reader something and like get a certain point across and really like hammer that into them and sort of at the expense of the art. Another way I've heard pretentious, uh, I remember I watched a movie called Cinema Paradiso. An amazing movie. I love this movie. And it's a film about film. It's like a love letter to Italian cinema. And I came out of the film, and one of the people I was watching it with said that felt kind of pretentious, which I thought was crazy because I loved it. But that it was this thing so obsessed with itself, right? Art that is self referential, that, is sort of impenetrable to outside people because it's just film about film. And if you don't like film, it's not for you. Um, and I think, you know, this is a poem about poetry, right? This is kind of the first thing I said. It's an ars poetica. And you sort of mention like, inspiring people like me somewhere or people like us somewhere. My people, right? You say toward the end of the poem. And I don't think that's pretentious, right? I don't think it's pretentious to make a poem that's a love letter to your own art, right? We can be inspired by our own creation. Maybe some people would say that, um, but then you have to go and kind of say that every poem about poetry is pretentious, and I just think that's kind of an unwise thing to do. Uh, I'm not someone who is eager to brand a poem as pretentious. But this doesn't feel like it looks down upon someone, right? Maybe if this poem said something like, "If you're not making art, you're the villain in the fairy tale story," then it would be like, man, maybe I'm not an artist. Maybe I just like reading poetry. That's kind of pretentious of you to say, right? And maybe that's where this poem would become something like that. But it doesn't, right? I don't think it looks down on the non poet, but it says, like, for those who create and those who make art and come together in this way, however you come together, we can make beautiful. We can make the world beautiful. And if that's what you believe, that's not a pretentious thing to believe. I think sort of the fact of you being, concerned about pretentiosity probably tells me that it's not going to be a problem in your art. I think someone who is pretentious uh, is probably very, very egoistic, very not self critical, and just makes these things with like this, agenda and this ego and this sense of superiority. Um, that you wrote a poem with this kind of message, that you're, asking, is it pretentious in this way? Um, Probably tells me that that's not a problem for you in your poetry, and it doesn't read as pretentious for me. So that's that's very good. It's a great question though, right? Asking about how we bridge this gap, and this question also of how we create poetry with clarity that really like communicates our message. I think sharing and rereading our work can be very useful. I just think writing a lot and reading a lot right? To continue to bridge this gap between hard to understand and thought provoking, I think is one of these like core questions in poetry that just comes from a lot of iteration and like I said earlier, a lot of failing, right? And also intentionally writing poems that are very obscure. That might be a fun practice. Sometimes I like to suggest, writing prompts or whatever. Write something with no consideration for how hard it is to understand. Just be entirely inside your own head. Be self referential and nonsensical for a page of poetry. And I think in exploring the space of hard to understand, obscure, veiled, it is probably good practice in how to write something that is very clear, right? So that might be a way to further explore that space. Also, in terms of pretentious, you can look for works that people say are pretentious or that even you think are pretentious. And you can investigate these things and say, what is it about this that strikes me as pretentious? And I think once you understand what that is for you, how art might give you the feeling that it's being pretentious toward you as the reader, then it will probably help you avoid making those same, we'll say mistakes in your own art. And then you can, that's two ways to kind of free yourself from these two things that you consider maybe negative aspects of a poem, right? And I think that's all I have to say. Um, it's a really lovely poem, Fairy Dust by Kate, and I'm going to read it again. And to wrap this one up, here's Fairy Dust. I don't like dust. How careless it is. Lifeless, gray, and dull, erasing the ancestors who unleashed the hope for something more, because the dust is all that people can see. Makes me sneeze in an attempt to silence me, replacing discovery with dust. I've written over the poem now that I can't actually read it. We keep choking without changing. Then there's no fear of failing. I insist. I will never become dusty. There's nothing subtle here. My arms are made to wrap around you and never let go. My arms let me release my creativity. You cannot stop me from writing. They are tools to extract my thoughts from my brain and extend them to your ears. Let my words be the spell that keeps us wishing. I turn into a fairy when I step on stage. My wings are my voice when I read to you. My wand is the pen I use to write. And when I fly with passion, other people rise up too. So I will use it with conviction. When the dark days just keep coming, I will be here to light the way. Not only do my feet leave footprints, but my mind leaves imprints too. My poetry forms a trail of identity and artistry like fairy dust, leaving hope for my people. As we know, the best writing is made when we all come together. So come on, let's make the world shimmer. Fairy Dust by Kate. And thank you. That was a really lovely poem, and thank you so much for sending that. Of course, having the courage to submit and share poetry, especially to like my random YouTube channel on the internet, a stranger, right? I really appreciate that, and it's really wonderful writing. Certainly love to see more of it in the future if you liked this. And yeah, I hope that helps. So now we'll move on to the next poem, for today's video, and that poem is titled Serenity Beach by Isaac Green. And here it is, Serenity Beach. 10,000 waves crash, swell, and billow to breathe up the shore, frothing in draves. 10,000 tides spit, chew, and swallow all footsteps that come and each castle of pride. 10,000 stones tumble, toss, and turn to deliver for a child rocks to skip and throw. 10,000 souls here, gone and going, make waves of their own, playing in the shoal. Serenity Beach. So, this is a very short poem, and I think it packs a lot in through its very specific imagery. And this poem's interesting because it's just giving us like these four little images of this, these scenes at, this, we'll say, Serenity Beach, and we're left to interpret that and, put the pieces together. And it's very clear that Isaac, who has submitted, wants me to interpret that because we have lots of questions about this poem, which is great. I love having lots of questions. And I think we can really approach this poem just through these questions. And there's a whole bunch of them. What central themes does this poem touch upon? What might the use of the number 10,000 represent? What might the waves and tides represent? What might the shore represent? What might the child represent? What might the rocks represent? In the fourth stanza, the word souls was used in the spot where characteristics of the waves and the water were used. In the previous stanzas, what might this imply or emphasize? So, lots of things to cover. I'm not sure I will have answers for all of these questions. We'll see. But we can start with the first one, right? What are the central themes of this poem? Now, I think we have to start to dig in and understand what's going on. So, 10,000 waves crash, swell, and billow to breathe up the shore, frothing in draves. So I had to look this word up before I started this poem. Draves. There's sort of like an archaic meaning to this that's something like shoal, which is at the bottom of the poem, which is like a collection of fish. So this is like a very obscure nautical term. And that's definitely like the big piece of imagery that we have in this poem, right, is the ocean. Everything in this poem really connects to that, right? Now, it's the second stanza that starts to help me understand like some of the themes of this poem. 10,000 tides spit, chew, and swallow all footsteps that come and each castle of pride. Right? So if the tide coming up onto the beach, spit, chew, and swallow all footsteps that come. So, right, every footprint that we leave on the beach eventually gets swallowed, chewed away via the water. And same with each castle of pride. I think this is a lovely turn of phrase to refer to, a sandcastle. Because more broadly, it can also refer to just the things that people create, right? The works of man. So it can work on two levels as a double meaning, right? A sandcastle, you'll make it. It's kind of prideful to put your human stamp on the beach, and the sea will take it. But also any castle we create, anything that man creates gets reclaimed, right? By nature, by particularly the ocean as this, monster, as this destructive force. So then in this stanza, we outline a theme, a very important theme of, I would say, like impermanence. And the impermanence of people, right? And we see later, right, 10,000 souls here, gone, and going, making waves of their own, playing in the shoal, right? And maybe we have this idea of the soul as the person, as the human, um, reclaimed and taken by the ocean. Now, sort of this distant memory in the water or something. I think this poem is like exceptionally vague in the ways that it can be interpreted, and that's a very good thing. I think it works very well because it has a really nice core of imagery on the poem, where a lot of these images can probably be interpreted in a number of ways, and it might take a few reads to really uncover the secrets of a poem like this. 10,000 stones tumble, toss, and turn to deliver for a child rocks to skip and throw. This is again, a lovely bit of imagery. So we have this idea of the water, first of all, slowly like eroding stone, right? The water smooths stones into, something flat and smooth, which are then the kind of rocks that we would skip on the water, which is, what we have later to skip and throw. Also, I love skip and throw as these two just childish things on their own, right? That skipping and throwing things are both these activities done by children. I think that's a lovely kind of connection there. But we use this lovely word, deliver, right? As if this thing has been made specifically, given specifically to the child. And that's a really kind of strong word to use here, especially I think in contrast to like spit, chew, swallow, the sea as something that takes away, takes away. We have this contrast put in place of the sea as something that gives. This is also a cool scene. I like this a lot because if we think about the child who gets the rock, right, we have like the water and then the beach. And the sea sort of, churns and spits up these smooth rocks onto the beach for the child to throw. And then they get thrown back out into the water. And it creates this cycle, right? This cyclical kind of thing. And I think that feels to me, right, like another one of these themes, a sort of cyclicality, right? The idea of building the castle, taking the footsteps, and it going away, right? The stone being washed up, the child throwing it, new stones being washed up. 10,000 souls here, gone, and going, right? So we have like the present, the person who's alive, the one who is dead, the one who is dying. And so it creates this aspect of that, cycle of death and life, right? And then like even making waves of their own, this idea of, that effect, that rippling effect of life as this sort of, cause and effect, which I think ties in with this feeling of cycles, right? At the beginning, we have 10,000 waves, crash, swell, and billow, to breathe up the shore, frothing in draves. The words here work really nicely for me. Billow, we have billow as something of air, right? Things billow in the wind and flags billow. Also kind of sounds like bellow. Both of these connect to air and breath, and then even like frothing, right? The idea of bubbles and air within water. And then also, right, that a wave froths onto shore and is this ephemeral, billowing, airy thing that then dissolves, right, creates another one of these cyclical things of impermanence. And those are the themes that I think like stick out to me on, a first few reads. And now we can maybe dig into these specific things, and that might help us find more, right? What might the use of the number 10,000 represent? And this is interesting because the number 10,000 itself doesn't stick out to me too much as like any singular thing that culturally I'm familiar with. Uh, like I think maybe like humans have been around on Earth for 10,000 years. Uh, and so maybe there's that idea, 10,000, just like the scope of human civilization, impermanent against the span of time. I would say 10,000 years human civilization, not humans, right? I think humans have been around for like half a million years or something. I don't know. Poet, not a scientist. Um, right. There's like, we're talking about like fish, sort of, with like shoal, and we're talking about death and impermanence, which makes me think of like Christian myth, right? Where you have like Jesus feeding people with fish, but I'm like pretty sure that's 5,000, and that doesn't totally like resonate in a particular way with like the other themes in this poem too much. Uh, but I guess like 10,000 does have this feeling as a number of something big and kind of mythological. If we're going to throw out a number of a lot of years, more years than we can understand, like 10,000 is a pretty good start. Um, but I think maybe it just speaks to multitudes, right? And a scale beyond our understanding. I think that's about when my brain starts to tap out of like how big something actually is. I can understand 1,000. 1,000's not that big. But like 10,000's a lot of stuff. And, maybe at that point, right, it can speak to a sort of another theme of like the scale of nature and the immensity of, sort of things going on in the world that is so far beyond the human scope, right? And so, like the fact that we ask, right, what does it represent, makes me think it wants to be representing something specific. And I think as poets, as readers, even when we're not prompted, it's useful to look at these things like, oh, 10,000. Maybe that means something. It might not, but taking the exercise to try to understand that as a symbol and as a deeper meaning can be rewarding to us as a reader, right? Uh, and I think maybe to me what sticks out is like the scale of human civilization. Humans have been building things for 10,000 years, at least like structures we have evidence of. And so, like, to connect it with the castles of pride and the erosion of humanity, right? I think it makes a lot of sense. And then this is a very human poem with the deliver for a child. Also, great use of words, deliver with child, right? A child is delivered when they're born. There's this feeling of birth and creation in this poem. Very there's like this strong spiritual tone to the poem, and maybe that's why I jumped to the Christian thing as well. Maybe there's some religion that has like 10,000 year cycles. That sounds like it would make sense for a poem like this. Um, the fact that it's like Serenity Beach, and we're talking about life and death and children and old people, right? Going, um, this connection of like man and nature. I think that makes sense to me. Um, I totally got lost. Yeah, so 10,000 at least to me just speaks of this sort of large scale human, at the edge of human comprehension. And and it's funny because we don't even necessarily say like years or anything. um, but in the fact of talking about like all things human being eroded and being taken away by nature, it sort of connects to that to me in a way. Uh, yeah. What might the waves or tides represent? Right. That's your next question. And I think we can think of the waves if we're talking about cycles and impermanence in time, not strictly as nature, but also, I just said it, as time itself, right? This thing that continually moves on and continues to shape the coastlines of reality and nature, um, constantly eating away at some things and creating new things and just being like the proponent of change in the world, right? And maybe I'm too stuck on this idea of like years and time, but that's what it feels like to me, right? This idea of a representation within nature of that constant evolution, that constant change and momentum of existence, right? Uh, they could also just be literal waves, and I think they are, right, within the imagery of the beach. Um, and I don't know. Water. One way to approach something like this, a question of what do the waves represent? We can just think generally of how water is used in literature as a symbol, right? And water is often associated with time. Water can be associated with like memory, particularly with like reflection and sort of self. Water can be this big, dangerous, sort of monstrous thing, right? Water can be definitely just like life, right? For a lot of culture and symbology. I live in the desert, and like water is life. If you don't drink water, you will die out there very quickly. I guess they say that in Dune too, right? Water is life. Time, memory, reflection. We have like water as something sorrowful with like tears and all of that. uh, which maybe right connects this water and this passing of time with the idea of death, that humans would have some sorrow in this, right, of the loss of themselves. But it's also very impersonal, and I don't think this poem really carries much of that sorrow over the loss of humanity. It more just speaks to me to this dissociated view, I guess, of all things as cyclical, all things as ending, all things as passing through time. So I'm personally most inclined to say time, but I think there are other ways to read this for sure. What might the shore represent? Right, going through truly all of these little things, and I hadn't thought too much about the shore, but we have Serenity Beach first of all, right? So this is like a serene thing, as the title would say. Um, we have 10,000 waves crash, swell, and billow to breathe up the shore, frothing in draves. Breathe up, right? As if, to swallow it, to take it. 10,000 tides, spit, chew, and swallow, all footsteps that come, and each castle of pride. So the shore is that thing that humans make a mark on, right? And we take things from it. 10,000 stones tumble, toss, and turn to deliver for a child, rocks to skip and throw. So, right, we sort of throw things back out and make this effect on this world. 10,000 souls, here, gone, and going, make waves of their own, playing in the shoal. And I think, like, there's a really cool way to think about this poem that just came into my head of the beach in our little terrible drawing here. The beach is the world, and the ocean is something more like heavenly, right? And or like land as the world, and the beach becomes this like point of transition between life and death. That's a really cool image, and it kind of works, right? Um, Heaven is kind of constantly swallowing up, or the afterlife, or the dead, or this spiritual, whatever death, right? I'm not religious in any way. So choose your representation of this. Constantly swallowing up, things into this like entropic death. And humans kind of leave their mark on the world, and they try to build things, and it all gets swallowed, and they themselves get swallowed, right? And we have like the souls, right, playing in the shoal, which I think kind of would make sense in that way. This many fish, many souls passed on into another world. Um, I love soul and shoal. It's a good sound. There's a lot of good sound in this poem, right? We do have this waves, draves, tides, pride, stones throw. Ah, that's great. A stone's throw, right? The expression. Um, a lot of good sound here, which I could talk about in its own right. But you have a lot of questions about meaning. Uh, so yeah. Anyway, we have this like place of spiritual life and death transition, and I think there's a cool thing about like the child throwing rocks into an ocean in that way. Maybe children in this innocence to like not fear death and not fear the magical and the spiritual. Um, Maybe there's the childish thing of it's not literally a child, but it's a childish action to try to, throw things into the abyss and try to understand death and try to understand the nature of things. Could think of almost the child as like the scientist sending the rocket out into space to understand the unknown. Um, and all that will ever happen is, you know, the sea will keep churning, the unknown will keep, you know, spreading in new ways, right? Um, both of those readings of the child I quite like. So that's jumping ahead. What might the child represent? Someone who's like unafraid of these change or interested in pursuing the unknown, but also the child as a person who doesn't understand and so can kind of stare at this ocean with innocent, open eyes and just make play out of life. Right. The child is definitely contrasted against the castles of pride, something built where the child just throws in the water, just part of this cycle, this innocent kind of acceptance of how things are, which is lovely. So I think that's the shore and the child, right? Some readings of that. What might the rocks or the rock, right? The rocks to skip and throw. Um, That's a great question. Doesn't totally work with the other child. 10,000 stones tumble, toss, and turn to deliver for a child rocks to skip and throw. Right, so the rocks are this thing that's eroded away slowly, which is definitely contrasted against the footsteps, against the castles, which seem to be chewed up and destroyed quickly. Right, there's something within this poem that are more permanent, but also not permanent. Just much more permanent than humans and our actions and our effects. 10,000 stones tumble, toss, and turn to deliver for a child rocks to skip and throw. And they are this, like, gift, right? I think this is just a very beautiful image, the gift that the ocean is giving, which the child then kind of throws back for fun. Um, and maybe there's something there of like the gifts that the world or the time gives. Maybe there's something there of like knowledge or like grasping onto things where the child remains innocent by taking what time has given them and throwing them back into the ocean, um, to like maintain this sort of joyful state. In that case, this poem could get real like Eastern philosophy, um, right? Taoism, Buddhism. Oh my gosh, I cannot type or type, right? Um, Philosophy, right? Eastern philosophy with his like relinquishing of things and this sort of, you know, Buddhists or Zen practitioners talk about like the childlike mind, um, and in that way, the rocks could represent this thing to be relinquished, right? This acceptance of like a cyclical existence where things are given and lost. Uh, and that would be quite beautiful. Um, it could also just represent, in turn, with the child, right? Just this idea of play, just this idea of not caring too much about things and just enjoying life, right? The child throwing rocks, I mean, seems to be the really positive symbol, right? Not to stack these rocks, not to turn them into a monument, not to appreciate their beauty, but just to take them and throw them back, just to like be part of this cycle, just to like live one's serene, peaceful life. It makes this a really kind of beautiful world to escape to. Um, this sort of like peaceful skipping rocks into eternity. Um, it's very simple. I love this poem for its simplicity. I think that's one of the best parts. It's just short, it's concise, doesn't say everything, wants to leave the reader to interpret. And I think these are all really like challenging questions that probably say a lot about the reader and their interpretation. Um, Nothing that I say here is the truth of this poem, uh, and I think it would be a really lovely activity for anyone else to go try to answer these questions on their own. Ideally, before you'd listen to me talk about it for half an hour, but it's beside the point. Last question. In the fourth stanza, the word souls was used in the spot where characteristics of the water/ocean was used. What might that imply? And to me, right, we have the waves, we have the tides, we have the stones as these products of nature. And when we place souls inside of it, we place humans within the cycle of nature, right? Then this poem says, like, we humans aren't special, aren't exempt from the scale of time and life, and it says we're just another thing in the ocean of existence. It makes it very like humbling, I think. Right? We say a soul is just a wave, a soul is just a tide, a soul is just a stone, and those things are just souls. Interesting, right? Because it kind of, you could almost read this in a sort of animistic way, that the stones and the tides and the waves have souls, right? And it says nature is this like embodied soulful thing, which is super cool. And it could read the other way of, souls are just these mere, impermanent, tiny objects in a world so far beyond themselves. And that's awesome. That's a beautiful, true thing to say, right? And a beautiful thing to say in such a small little wave of a poem, right? This poem in itself is just a little, by that logic, just a little wave, just a little soul, just a tiny fraction of a larger existence. 10,000 souls here, gone and going, make waves of their own, playing in the shoal. And this poem is so warm at the end when we have playing in the shoal and we have the child playing, right? As to say, like, that sort of essence of the soul, not even the human soul, but like the soul of all things is like play, that it's just this like kind of miraculous unfolding of life, and the rocks are playing as much as the child is playing, and the waves are playing with each other, and the tides play, and it's all this just joyful unfolding, right? It's extraordinarily Taoist in philosophic sentiment, that reading of this poem, and I really like the Tao. So that maybe makes sense that I'd come to a place like that with this poem. Uh, but yeah, playing in the shoal, right? Just these schools of fish dancing, billowing. It's all the imagery is so consistent, right? Waves, billow, crash, swell. You really like take us so good and like spit, chew, and swallow to describe the sea itself as like human is so cool because then we create this layer through like this characterization that the sea is sort of like alive, right? And the sea is like light and billowing and it's crashing. We're creating something tumbling and tossing and turning. We're creating skipping and throwing and play. We're creating like truly like the full range of qualitative description and of existence, right? Through these descriptions, through just this single image, right, of the beach, of the ocean, of these souls and this child. Uh, so simple, right, and so powerful. And I think this is the thing with short poems, right? Brevities, as some would call them. Uh, they become very difficult because you don't have that much space, right? To say what you want to say. And so it necessarily becomes sort of vague. It necessarily becomes sort of um, impenetrable. I think I've used that word a number of times in this video now, right? But to contain kind of like the multitude of life within something small is so very impressive. And it works specifically for a poem like this, which is discussing, I think, the multitude of life, the soul, as something very small. That seems like a good place to leave this analysis. So I'll read it one more time. Serenity Beach by Isaac Green. 10,000 waves crash, swell, billow, to breathe up the shore frothing in draves. 10,000 tides spit, chew, swallow, all footsteps that come, and each castle of pride. 10,000 stones tumble, toss, turn to deliver for a child rocks to skip and throw. 10,000 souls here, gone, going, make waves of their own, playing in the shoal. Serenity Beach by Isaac Green. Lovely, lovely poem. And two lovely poems today, Serenity Beach and Fairy Dust. Many, many thanks, Isaac Green and Kate, and you both of you for submitting such lovely works and giving me the opportunity to read them. I love reading poetry, and if it can help other people and be inspiring and interesting, then that's all the better, right? So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, right? And for people who are still watching, if you would like to submit a poem to have me do this, to read these poems with arguably this very precise level of care and zooming in, you can submit to the Google form that's down below. It's like just a few questions. Or if you're interested in more, You can watch my live streams, which are on Twitch and here on YouTube 4 times a week. I'm just getting off a break, so now I'll be coming back to doing them regularly again. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays. So hopefully I'll, see people there if they're interested. And yeah, that's all for this one. I feel like there are more things I'm supposed to say as like a outro, but yeah, submit your poetry if you like this. And there still haven't been like that many submissions, so now is the time to like submit and like have me see it quickly before like people probably find this and it gets backed up and then it takes much longer. So do that, and I'll see you on the next episode, whenever that is.